My pleasure to welcome back again our distinguished panelists today for our second panel. We will start with Daria Mattingly from the University of Chichester, who will talk about the rank and file perpetrators of the Holodomor. We follow with Valeriy Vasylyev, who will talk about the Kremlin's direct rule in the conduct of the Holodomor, and we'll conclude with the organizer of this fabulous gathering, Professor Naimark from Stanford, who will talk about the Holodomor and the current invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Daria, you're most welcome.
Thank you for having me here and inviting me to present and share my understanding of rank and file perpetrators. And I promise to address 25,000 is mouthful. And when I'm talking about rank and file perpetrators of the 1932-33 famine, I'm talking about
village officials and district officials, as well as many other participants on district and village level who facilitated the orders that led to starvation. And I'm using the word perpetrators, which some of my colleagues, revisionist historians in particular, have reservations about. So I will explain why perpetrators. I signify the actors whose actions or lack of actions led to the starvation, suffering, death of millions in 1932-33 famine in Ukraine. And of course there are objections to such a use for various reasons, from the Holocaust relativism to the absence of the smoking gun documents to prove intentions. But the more, as today in the previous panel has been mentioned, the more you study the Holodomor, the more it becomes obvious that intentionality is on the surface. And the policies, the decisions, the reaction of the top leadership in the Kremlin, as well as the rank-and-file perpetrators and how they made sense of their participation and what they did and how the mechanism of the famine was working. And the myth of Russian Empire being inherently different to that of the West that has been already mentioned today, that it is not an empire, does not stand any scrutiny when we look at the Holodomor or, for that matter, 1931 famine in Kazakhstan as well, because we are seeing clearly a colonial famine. And to that question, I would like to add also that we're still using the terms suggested by the metropole, by the center. For example, when we're discussing the famine, we're discussing the aid that was given to some collective farms in 1933. It is not the aid. What is the aid or the famine relief? It is the grain that had been previously taken from the same peasants that it is then given. And to go back even further, I would go back more than 10 years ago. In 1917 actually, elections to the Constituent Assembly in the Russian Empire, former Russian Empire, Ukrainians didn't vote for the Bolsheviks. They voted for national parties predominantly. They voted for Essery, so not Bolsheviks. So Ukrainians didn't support the Bolsheviks, and we can see that clearly in memoir and cultural memory, in archival documents. And so when we are using that, Bogdan Klid was saying that Ukraine owed nothing, but since it was a colony, it was exploited. And but I'm getting distracted by the previous discussion. So back to the perpetrators. What I consider the acts of perpetration during the famine, it was, but not limited, it was the acts of removal of food, but also preventing the victims from obtaining food elsewhere, in the fields, in the storehouses, but preventing them from leaving the villages, which has been discussed in Bogdan's presentation, boarding the trains, either leaving the villages to go to towns in Ukraine or even to leave the Republic. And there is an abundance of material, both in archives, in cultural memory, and many participants do describe what they did. And I was shocked, for example, to discover in the memoir of celebrated Stahanovite Maria Demchenko, published in 1970s, how she described how she poked the soil with a metal prod to find something hidden by her neighbors, and how neighbors were using the dogs to get rid of her. Then Pasha Angelina, celebrated female tractor driver, she described similar accounts, and also how she was fleeing from her fellow villagers, and how she was struck by lightning, and everybody interpreted that as a poetic justice for something she's done in 1932-33. So there is plenty of those documents that we can use. But obviously from the point of view of the Imperial Center, and from the point of view of the perpetrators that were involved in this mechanism of the famine, there were legislative provisions and decrees, all of which scholars of the Holodomor are well aware of and were mentioned today. For example, 22nd of January, preventing Ukrainians leaving the Republic and sealing the borders. So from their point of view, what they were doing was perfectly legal. They were either following the orders, but they were still operating within the state, and that was state-sanctioned violence. Also, calling them perpetrators does not deny or downplay the fact that the famine was organized or orchestrated and overseen by the top leadership. And my colleague Valeriy Vasylyev published a fantastic collection of documents many collections actually, that show that Stalin and his envoys were acutely aware of what was happening on the ground, and also they were involved in giving the orders to the district officials in case of Rychitsky. Telegrams were going back and forth between the Kremlin and these carriages where Molotov and Kaganovich were, so they were discussing everything they saw, and they were clearly pursuing the policies that took the lives of millions in Ukraine and are responsible for that crime, as any politician who pursues the policy despite the knowledge would be. So rank and file perpetrators are not mere cogs, and they deserve scholarly attention should we understand how the famine within the famine was possible. They did have agency. And a crucial document in that respect, I consider the unedited stenogram or minutes transcription of the third-party conference in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, in July 1932, when it could be actually compared to Wannsee conference in the Holocaust, when the targets were leveraged down from the Kremlin onto Ukraine, and Republican leadership was not so sure whether they can fulfill those targets. They were lowered 3 times, never fulfilled. But at the time, we see district officials, I think 11 out of 40, standing up and saying that we're already devastated by the famine. How can we do anything else? How can we procure cabbages in Zhytomyr province when we don't have cabbages and carrots ourselves? How can we do that for Leningrad? And But by 1933, such objections were already non-existent. But what we see in July 1932, district officials speaking up, then reports by the security services in August 1932, we can see that village officials, following district officials, are also speaking up. About 1/3 of them are saying that, here's my party ticket, I'm not doing anything because that would mean killing people. People are already starving. We are taking the last from them. And also show trials, such as Orikhiv case, showed that even before the actual repressions in connection with grain procurement took place in late in 1932 in November, and people were arrested, we see that in August and September, without knowledge, like we know what happened to them, some officials chose to resist. And then we see that when they were arrested in November 1932, out of those put on trial, only 0.6% were actually executed by the firing squad. So the risk of not following the orders, the risk of being punished or repressed for that, it pales in comparison to the risk that the victims faced, because we know how many people died from starvation. And in fact, when I worked in the archives where Olga was working as well at SDAHO, so party archive in Republican level in Kiev, I see that many officials on district or village level who refused to follow the orders were just moved from one district or one village to another district in the same capacity. So they certainly didn't go to Gulag. They were needed to carry on the activity. So, apart from the archives, I also drew on the corpora of oral memory, interviews, and cultural texts, including memoirs, diaries, which led me back to the archives to cross-check what the sources were telling me. And some perpetrators were, let's say, economical with the truth. They either described, like a famous Soviet dissident, Lev Kopelev, described themselves as true believers, that they believed these peasants in Poltava province were Japanese spies and they did nothing and there is no blood on their hands, just like some perpetrators of crimes during Russian invasion are saying as well, who defected to the West, saying, I have no blood on my hands, some others did it, I didn't. Or I didn't see Russian troops committing crimes. Likewise, Kopelev said, yes, I confiscated, later in his memoirs published in the West, yes, I confiscated valuables from the peasants in Poltava province, but nobody starved. And by the way, there is no blood on my hands. But when I went to the village where he worked, and when I went to the SBU archives, Security Services archives, and just cross-examined the testimonies of people who worked alongside with him, people were dying in that village. 2,000 out of 6,000 inhabitants in that village died from starvation exactly when he was working there and later on. So, and deprived of all valuables they could exchange for food. Some were as desperate as swapping their whole houses for a loaf of bread. And some of the stories, as Olga was saying, are too poignant to recount. But over the 9 years, which was my doctoral thesis and later postdoctoral research, of working with many documents and interviewing one perpetrator who was 15, 16 years old at the time of Komsomol, and obviously going through all the party tickets, the picture becomes clear. They were ordinary people at the extraordinary circumstances. And demographic profile shows that they represented people of all walks of life, and ethnic makeup of the perpetrators, age. They are not much different from perpetrators of other cases of mass violence and genocides. Yes, they are predominantly men, but so are perpetrators of other genocides and cases of mass violence. And yes, I would say, and conformity, everything about them proves how tragic it was, the mechanism of the Holodomor, and how it compromised many parts of society. Institutionally, they represented not only district officials and village officials, but they also represented youth organizations, committees of non-wealthy peasants, motor tractor stations that were mentioned today, party members. So, for example, the heads of the village council, the head of the collective council, collective farmers activists, teachers. And teachers, were talking about 40,000 teachers working in the countryside in 1932-33. Yes, there were those who were deemed to be bourgeois nationalists, but majority of them compile. And there are, in cultural memory, there are many accounts of being a compromised perpetrator. So institutionally, you name it, prosecution, law enforcement, army, plenipotentiaries, 25,000, almost 8,000 of them worked in Ukraine. And however, I would add to Victoria's note on them, a majority of them did come from Ukrainian Socialist Republic. But they came, just like Lev Kopelev, from urban centers, and they spoke Russian. And to many people on the ground, they seemed Russian. And they were indeed representatives of that imperial center. They were imperial agents. And Kopelev himself described working for the greater good. And in his discussion of Ukrainian peasants, we can see clearly this imperial discourse where he does not associate himself with the peasants. He doesn't see humans in them. In fact, I would compare that to British colonial discourse on natives in Africa in a way. Goethe, the grass is singing. Ukrainians are something to be feared if they're not controlled. They get violent, and Kopelev mentions the violence 10 years prior during the Great Peasant Uprising in 1919. And then we see that in other cultural texts where their resistance to collectivization and grain procurement is directly connected to them not supporting Bolsheviks in 1919, 1918. They are not to be trusted. Also, thanks to the open archives, we know the conditions in which these people worked at, men and women who facilitated the famine on the ground. They found themselves in a very difficult situation, and many wrote letters, notes, sometimes suicidal notes, about inability to continue their work, especially after Stalin's article "These were success," when there was a temporary retreat in collectivization. They said what we were fighting for, what we were killing people for, and children, and seeing them starving. They are talking about 1930. And I found statistics, again, in the party archive, that about 30 to 40% of first-time plenipotentiaries did desert their deployment during grain procurement in 1932. So they already faced famine, and they could see that even if they were 25,000, there is no grain. There is no underground hoarding facilities by the peasants, so to speak. When it comes to the motivation that has been mentioned today, I borrow from perpetrator studies, from Alex Miller's in particular, that there are 6 major groups based on perpetrators' motivation. The first is professional, people who are trained to enforce law with force. And we're talking about militia or police and army and security services. And indeed, they were critical, they were crucial in enforcing it. Then we're talking about profiteers, people who somehow benefit either by securing resources, power positions, material goods, sending their children to the city, towns to study. Then fanatics, the third group, which is about 5 to 10% of all participants. So when we're talking about communism, people believing in propaganda, yes and no. Even today, when we're talking about, when there is discussion about Russian support in the war, many express that even if they don't support the war, they support their country, they are patriots. So therefore they are mobilized and they are going to do it. Even if they escape mobilization, they are not necessarily supporting Ukraine. And then there are sadists and criminals, that's the fourth group. But majority, like I said just now, are conformists, people who follow the orders, about 60%. And then there is the sixth group of compromised people who are starving themselves, who, what Olga mentioned, sometimes are going through psychotic stage, and they do participate. And the system is using their vulnerability in order to push them into participation. But you can belong to several groups at the same time. And one of the key questions here, how do you draw the line to cast them as perpetrators? Of course, comparing to the Holocaust studies or Raoul Hilberg's victims, perpetrators, bystanders, here the borders between these groups are very blurred in a way. For example, how would you call village correspondents or journalists reporting on their neighbors for not working in the field and therefore not qualifying for food in the field, a collective farm, or inciting violence? Or collective farm cook who got her job through sexual barter was the head of the collective farm and now brings some food home to feed her own children and therefore taking it away in the kindergarten from other children? Or how should we cast the train conductors who didn't let the starving peasants board the train to escape the starvation? And I could see in the archives a discussion, there are even separate folders on train workers, on conductors not being vigilant enough, letting victims on board to escape. Or implicated subject, to borrow from Michael Rothberg, if they benefited from grain procurement indirectly when settled, for example, in the villages devastated by the famine. But logistics on the ground would require many participants, and indeed, in case of the 3 villages that I looked in my study, up to 30% of all inhabitants in any particular villages were involved in the mechanism of the Holodomor in one or other capacity. For example, guarding the storehouse or guarding the fields in summer 1933, or taking grain from the storehouse to the train station. But what is important here, and it has been mentioned about the effect it had on the society, and I'm going to talk about here just to share my understanding that it did affect village society, and by doing so, Ukrainian society more largely, by habituating it to violence and also. Well, I don't agree with theory of extra-violent societies, Nikola's word, because we are risking orientalizing the Ukrainians by saying, oh, they are violent. But it devalues the human lives lost in the famine as well, because we should accept that human life, no matter in what country, it is the highest value. So instead, I would like to reiterate that empires rarely places any value on human life of their subjects, of the colonial subjects. And the USSR was no exception. Human life never mattered for the top leadership. And the Ukrainians presented a risk to the Soviet project. They presented a threat to the Soviet empire, and therefore, obviously, from their perspective, the authority could be compromised by resistance to collectivization and grain procurement, and Stalin took no chances. And another important point on social history of the famine is that, apart from habituation to violence, is that what Andrea Graziosi calls collectivization and the famine created a new ancien regime, a modern regime, so where post-famine, money didn't matter in the collective farm. It mattered who you knew in charge of the resources. If you knew the head of the village council or the head of the collective farm, it meant access to the resources. It meant access to the opportunities. And therefore, it's not a modernization project any longer because it didn't create a modern society. And we still have echoes of that today in Ukraine. It still suffers that after effect of the Holodomor. And obviously, it didn't do any favors to the Soviet project as such because there was no support for the Soviet project in the 1980s, and the agriculture was destroyed. It was a disaster from all points of view. But it was also a disaster for Ukraine in the absence of civil society, a nascent civil society that was destroyed in the 1930s. That on the village level, perpetrators stayed with their victims for many years to come. In fact, when I was interviewing a family of the perpetrator 5 years ago, they showed me this man's memoir of the 1980s. So he felt threatened by glasnost. He felt threatened by he felt compelled to write his recollection and his narrative. And by doing so, he showed the power relations in the village. And these people stayed in the villages. They were headmasters of schools teaching history to their victims. Victims still depended on them. And there was no justice. And that's why when I started researching perpetrators, I was informed by cultural memory. And in cultural memory, there was always poetic justice for the perpetrators, because how could somebody escape by killing their fellow villagers? And in cultural texts, and I'm talking about works written in diaspora since 1991, we have poetic justice for the perpetrators. Unfortunately, based on my research, there was no such poetic justice in the absence of the actual criminal justice. They didn't suffer strokes, alcoholism more often than regular villagers, ordinary or their victims. However, in cultural memory, and here I'm drawing to conclusion, there are tropes in depicting perpetrators. In Soviet, based on their agency again, so that's to reiterate, they did have some degree of agency. In Soviet novels, poetry, drama, films, and museums, and village museums, by the way, still have many of them on the honor boards as heroes, some village museums. We see embraced agencies. So they were indeed true believers, they did a lot, and that in a way defies this myth that the famine, nobody could talk about it. You could talk about it if you talked about the famine within the official narrative. So that was collectivization and grain procurement. And yes, people were swelling with hunger, but they were doing that to themselves, just like Ukrainians always try to kill themselves when Russia advances, and during collectivization. And they embraced. But also what we find between the lines and mention, we learn a lot, that there was violence, people died, there was sexual violence. Surprisingly, there are mentions about it against activists, but they are heroes. That's embraced agency. Then there is erased agency in diaspora, and since 1991, when they're described as the other, perpetrators are Jewish, Russians, or prodigal sons of Ukrainian nation, but they are not true Ukrainians. Unfortunately, the picture is more nuanced. There are many shades. And that's where the third trope in depiction in cultural memory in novels is when they are described as very nuanced. And Victoria already mentioned Vasily Grossman's work. It's very nuanced work, and I recommend it to my students to read, to understand what was happening on the ground. But there is poetic justice as well. In fact, his perpetrator, there was a female perpetrator. She was a 25,000er who came to Donbass to collectivize and then procure grain, and it was based on the real person. In the novel, Vasily Grossman kills her. She dies of cancer, poetic justice. She repents, there is a confession. And indeed, people who I interviewed sometimes perpetrated. In particular, he was almost 100 years old when there was a confession, and his family didn't know he was a perpetrator. I was invited to interview him as a victim, and he tells me how he searched the house. And they never spoke to me after that again, because it was a family secret that didn't mean to come out. But here we've got a confession in Vasily Grossman's. There was no confession in real life, and she lived very happily in central Moscow, cooperated with security services, and died with her own death. And so, yes, so nuanced the works of Yevhen Hutsalo, Vasily Grossman, and a few others, Anatoly Dimarov. So it's more nuanced, and it shows how Holodomor, what a profound effect it had on Ukrainian society. One more comment to make on perpetrators is that positionality, and Olga was discussing that when you interview people, And I know in the Holocaust studies, sometimes people become sympathetic or empathetic with their subjects. And among many Slavists, those who focus on Russia now are still sympathetic and empathetic and try to justify what not Russia did, but at least to exonerate. And somehow explain that it's Putin's war, not Russia's war. Sorry, I'm going off the topic of perpetrators. It is very difficult. It is a difficult subject, as Olga and my colleagues can attest. And I tried to maintain a distance. And what helped me is that I worked in the villages where I had no personal connections. And both victims and perpetrators tried to tell me their story, tried to tell me their side. And sometimes families were intermarried later on, their offspring are perpetrators and victims. And after a while, especially working in the archives, you're not conditioned to what you hear, but it still never takes away this shock, and sometimes you're repulsed what you learn, but it also explains today. And I think Ukrainian society, by addressing its traumatic past in the past and living it in the past, can move towards the future. So future doesn't have to be history, unlike in Russia and Masha Gessen says. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak at the conference. As we know, by 1931, collectivization and decolonization produced a severe food shortage in the Soviet Union. Under these conditions, Stalin and his entourage firmly demanded that regional leaders ensure the fulfillment of state grain procurement plans. Attention was focused on Ukraine and the North Caucasus, which supplied more than half the grain produced in the USSR. In 1930, state grain procurements in Ukraine amounted to 7.7 million tons, nearly 30.2% of the gross yield of grain crops. In 1931, when the harvest was far lower than that the previous year, Ukraine produced 7 million tons, or 41.3% of the gross grain crop yield. From December 1931 to March 1932, grain procurement continued in Ukraine under the direct control of Stalin and the Soviet Prime Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Vlad Chuber and Grigory Petrovsky, the head of the government and the Speaker of the Soviet-Ukrainian Parliament, aligned their positions and sent letters to the Kremlin on June 10th, informing the Soviet leaders of the imminent threat of widespread famine in Ukraine. First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Stanislav Kosior, gave the impression of remaining on the sidelines, assuming no responsibility for their actions. On June 12th, a secretary of the All Union Communist Party, Lazar Kaganovich, passed on both letters to Stalin, who was on vacation in the service. Stalin conveyed to Lazar Kaganovich on June 15, 1932, that the letters were not to his liking. He was particularly displeased with the attitude of Chuber, who was demanding additional millions of poods of grain from the Kremlin and cutbacks for the grain procurement plan. In all likelihood, Kaganovich, who knew Kosovo from joint activity in Kiev before the revolution, conveyed Stalin's impressions to him and also informed him of Stalin's severe dissatisfaction with the Ukrainian leadership. In further correspondence, Stalin expressed the opinion that Kosovo, Chuber, and other Ukrainian leaders were incapable of governing the republic, which had a double subtext. The political responsibility for the famine in Ukraine was placed directly on the leaders of Ukraine, who had not managed the grain procurement plans or the provision of food in the republic. That meant that the all-union Politburo should move ahead and remove the guilty from their positions. On July 2nd, Stalin wrote a letter to Kaganovich and Molotov suggesting the removal of Chubar and Kassior from their positions. He testified to his loss of confidence in the Ukrainian leadership, especially Chubar. From the perspective of the Kremlin, Kharkiv had lost its ability to comply with instruction and manage the socio-economic processes in the Republic. With the primary goal of realizing Stalin's directives on the organization of grain procurements, the All-Union Politburo decided to send Molotov and Kaganovich to the Third All-Ukrainian Party Conference on July 6 to 9, 1932. The duo managed to achieve their main goal. The largest communist party in the National Republic of the USSR, with almost 500,000 members, was officially validating the course taken by Stalin and his henchmen for the realization of a new grain procurement campaign. The Kremlin leaders well understood that they were condemning millions of people to death. The logic of their action might be explained as follows. Should grain procurement be rejected, that would negatively impact rich exports, the influx of hard currency, the purchase of equipment for factories being built, and, finally, the so-called tempo of socialist construction. It would then have become necessary to recognize the fallibility of Stalin's great breakthrough, Veliky Perelom, which would have resulted in their complete discreditation and all their life aspirations. Stalin was aware of and took into account the extent of dissatisfaction with his policy in society and inside the Communist Party. Along with a group of leaders who supported him, he understood that if they decided not to implement those policies, they might find it impossible to maintain their holding power in the party and the country. Those individuals preferred to continue to the end, condemning millions to death. After all, the ultimate goal of their policy was the creation of the communal state, Державы коммуны, following Vladimir Lenin, for which it was necessary to create artificial non-market economic relations and rebuild the structure of society in accordance with the Bolshevik Marxist worldview, a characteristic of Stalin and his comrade in arms. According to these ideological strictures, the state was to play the leading role in imposing a collective farm system, fulfilling the policy of grain procurement, and waging mass terror against various suspicious segments of the population. On August 17, 1932, a law was adopted on protection of public property. Popularly known as the Five Stalks Law, it provided for execution, along with the confiscation of all assets, for theft of collective farm or cooperative property, or, given mitigating circumstances, imprisonment for a minimum of 10 years, also with the confiscation of all assets. Amnesty in such legal cases was forbidden. It should be noted that the law was Stalin's personal initiative in July 1932, who incorporated his own amendments and additions. Along with the strengthening of repressive policies, Stalin, dissatisfied with the political immaturity and organizational capability of the Soviet Ukrainian leadership, enforced strict controls over its activity. On August 11th, he wrote Kaganovich a letter in which he stated that we may lose Ukraine, alleging that a widespread Polish intelligence network was active in the Republic, while Perpetrators in the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party might oppose their political line. Further in the letter, Stalin outlined the strategic objectives of the Soviet leadership with respect to Ukraine. Our goal must be to transform Ukraine as quickly as possible into a true bastion of the USSR, a truly exemplary republic. No expense should be spared. Without these and similar measures, the economic and political reinforcement of Ukraine, its border counties first and foremost, etc., I repeat, we may lose Ukraine. It is difficult to assess the likelihood of an active, widespread revolt by Ukrainian peasants with the support of elements of the local leadership against the central authorities. More likely, the people, weakened by hunger and repressive measures, were not physically capable of action. Stark recall how the forces of the GPU, Ukrainian SSR, had surprised mass, specifically armed anti-collectivization actions by peasants in early 1930. The incursion of Polish armies in Ukraine in case of a peasant uprising was also unlikely. In my opinion, the rationale behind Stalin's political accusation against the leadership of the Ukrainian SSR was above all preemptive in nature, with the goal of establishing stricter controls of the higher-ranking officials of the Ukrainian SSR and the party and government functionaries at the provincial and county levels, as well as preventing manifestations of their dissatisfaction. Stalin doubtless understood the depths of socio-economic crisis and the potential scale of the new famine looming in Ukraine. For example, on April 26, 1932, Stalin sent a memorandum to Kosovo from the management of the youth spirit, Union Alcohol, about armed attacks by hungry people on the warehouses of the trust factories. They were storing stocks of potatoes and beets for alcohol production. In his cover note, he wrote, "Comrade Kosovo, be sure to read the enclosed materials. It seems that in some points of the Ukrainian SSR, Soviet power has ceased to exist. Is it really true? Is it really so bad with the countryside in Ukraine? Where are the GPU organs? What are they doing? Maybe they should have ticked the case and reported of the Central Committee of the All Union Communist Party about the measures taken. Hi, Stalin." However, since no new political figures capable of implementing his political line in the Ukrainian SSR, he decided to leave the higher-ranking political leadership of the Republic in place, while reinforcing the functionaries of the low administrative rank. Mass transfer of officials from Russia to work in Ukraine have begun. During September-October, grain procurement rates in Ukraine dropped sharply. Alarmed, on October 22, the All-Union Politburo decided to dispatch a group of leaders headed by Molotov to Ukraine and another, headed by Kaganovich, to the North Caucasus. The actions of those groups, which referred to themselves as commissions, demonstrated that Stalin assigned his top lieutenants to a task that by then was expanded far beyond grain procurement policy. On the one hand, it was repressive measures that became the principal method of grain procurement. On October 29th, Molotov commissions arrived in Kharkiv. From that point on, decisions of the Republican leadership were made with the direct participation of or according the directives from members of the commission. The Kremlin assumed direct management of the Republic, circumventing the sub-center of power. In the directive on November 5th, issued to secretaries of provincial party committees, Molotov and Hatayevich, secretary of Ukrainian Politburo, demanded merciless punishment of criminal elements in collective farm management on the basis of a well-known decree on protecting communal property. On November 8th, Kosovo warned all provincial and county party leaders on behalf of the Ukrainian Central Committee that if they did not ensure rapid improvement of grain deliveries, resolute action would be taken with regard to the counties. This was a direct threat to party officials. On November 9th, a directive came down from Kremlin about the confiscation of all goods from counties that were not fulfilling the plan. On November 11th, the Ukrainian Politburo decided to end the sale of manufactured goods to individual farmers who refused to turn over their grain to the state. The plan was to post lists with the names of those individuals in stores and markets. They were charged all applicable fines and payments. Those who were sabotaging the grain procurement and those found with the grain buried in pits were to be resettled outside the county, and the most active deported from the region. It was proposed that kulaks who refused to give up their grain be arrested and their property sold. They too were to be resettled outside the region. At the Ukrainian Politburo session on November 18th that Molotov attended, a resolution was adopted on measures to strengthen grain procurement. In line, 600 communist functionaries from industrial centers were dispatched in brigades of 3 or 4 to villages where kulak sabotage and lack of organization in party activity had become particularly acute. These brigades were, in fact, allowed to conduct searches of peasant homesteads, confiscated not only grain but all foodstuffs. It is revealing that the fifth point in the minutes of the Ukrainian Politburo meeting on November 18th was a decision on transporting grain in the month of November. Accordingly, Ukraine, in addition to its export obligations, had until December 8th to deliver 99,000 tons of grain and 23,000 tons of wheat flour to Moscow, Ivanovo, the Transcaucasus, Gorky, Leningrad, Belarus, and the Crimea. Furthermore, it was planned to move out all stockpiles of wheat stores in railway depots. That would leave Ukraine with an inefficient reserve of grain. Obviously, Molotov's presence was needed for this decision. On November 20th, 1932, the Ukrainian GPU began a massive repressive operation that lasted until February 1933. Between November 1932 and February 1933, more than 390 anti-Soviet, counter-revolutionary, insurgent, and chauvinist organizations and groups were liquidated. 37,797 individuals arrested, of whom 719 individuals were sentenced to execution by firing squad. 8,003 sent to concentration camps, and 2,533 deported. Published data reveals that in 1932, 2,728 people were executed in the USSR. According to statistics of the GPU of Ukraine, between August and December 1932, 929 individuals were sentenced to execution in the Ukrainian SSR. Those sentenced to execution in Soviet Ukraine in the course of 5 months accounted for almost 30% of the total number of those executed in the USSR in 1932. At the beginning of 1993, tens of thousands of those arrested were taken from Ukraine to concentration camps in Russia. How should we characterize a political curse when millions were dying of starvation, but the country's leadership kept arresting, deporting, and killing tens of thousands of people? On December 14th, 1932, the All-Union Politburo adopted a resolution on grain procurements in Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the Western Province. It decreed that the fiercest enemies of the party, the working class, and the collective farmers were saboteurs of grain procurements with party memberships in their pockets. They would face judicial repression, 5 to 10 years sentences in the concentration camp, or execution by firing squad. It was affirmed that mechanical Ukrainization, which failed to take account of specific regional conditions, is the task of bourgeois nationalist elements and Petlurites who were establishing counter-revolutionary centers and organizations. On December 15th, a new resolution of the All-Union Politburo and Soviet government condemned public statement by individual Ukrainian comrades, referring specifically to articles by Mykola Skripnik, People's Commissar of Education of Ukraine, on the obligatory Ukrainization of a number of countries in the far Eastern Territory, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and the Central Chernozem province. Party and government bodies in those regions of the USSR were obliged to put an immediate end to further Ukrainization. In my opinion, the context of the aforementioned resolution of the Politburo testifies to the interweaving of the grain procurement campaign with nationality policy and repression measures inherent in the political line of the all-union leadership regarding Ukraine. Understandably, organized form of resistance to official policy were not widespread in late 1932. Published documents from the archive of the Security Service of Ukraine attest that there were no actual organization of kulaks, former officers, Kazakhs, or Petlurites. Either way, at the end of December 1932, two emergency commissions headed by Lazar Kaganovich and Pavel Postlusov were working in Ukraine, orchestrating a wave of repressions that claimed the lives of millions. This did not mean that society did not offer desperate resistance to Stalinist barbaric policies when the famine was spreading. However, active forms of resistance mostly changed to passive ones. We note that with the extremely harsh assessments, Stalin and his cohort laid the foundation for unprecedented repressive measures against all who were disgruntled and preemptive elimination of any hint of opposition. Furthermore, their resolution created their own reality in which the lives of millions were deemed meaningless. A few words about the mechanism of annihilation of the population at the local grassroots level, i.e. starvation murder, according to the eminent Ukrainian historic Stanislav Wyszynski. This is a mechanism of genocide in a compressed in time or direct physical destruction of an ethno-national group. On March 21, 1934, a short trial took place in the district center of Harbuzinka, Odessa region. The proceedings of the visiting session of the Supreme Court of the Ukrainian SSR were judged personally by the first deputy head of the GPU of the Ukrainian SSR, Zinovy Kuznetsov, which was unusual for their practice at that time. The main accused, 6 people were tried in total, was Anatoly Wrechitsky, a former candidate for the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Bolshevik, a writer by profession, biographer of Taras Shevchenko, and translator, the first to translate Marx Das Kapital into Ukrainian, a former member of the Ukrainian Communist Party, one of the 3 Communist parties in Ukraine until 1925. In November 1933, he was already sentenced to imprisonment and 10 years in concentration camps on charges of participating in the mythical fascist counter-revolutionary nationalist Ukrainian military organization, Українська військова організація. The 10 volumes of the Wrechitsky case contain more than 40 lengthy testimonies of interrogate collective farmers and individual farmers about the mass arrests, beatings, rapes, destruction of houses, massive fines and confiscation of all property and food from those who were either unable to pay the huge fine or who allegedly had hidden bread. There was also a significant number of complaints from villagers to village councils and collective farms boards about that the confiscated items, clothes, underwear, blankets, stoves, boots, overcoats, were not inventoried but were stolen by the members of so-called Iron Brigades. Before the interrogation of Wrechitsky, the court had testimony from the accused Kabzar, from Secretary of the Garbuzinsky District Party Committee, who recalls that on December 21, 1932, he was summoned to the government wagon at the railway station in the city of Voznitsensk, Odessa region. There, he met Pavlo Lyubchenko, the Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine Bolshevik, former Borodbist, member of Second Communist Party in Ukraine, and Wrechitsky. There were a dozen other secretaries of the party's district committees present. Lyubchenko said that for practical help in the struggle for bread, we sent for Comrade Trichisky, who has extensive experience in such matters. Since before he came to our districts, he had conducted similar work in the Vinnytsia region, where he achieved brilliant results. It is interesting to recall the diary of the trip of Kaganovich's commission to Ukraine at the end of December 1932. On the morning December 44, Kaganovich held a meeting with district party secretaries in the government train car in Voznесенsk. The records reads, Garbuzin districts, the secretary is Kobzar. They applied for the return of illegally transferred advances. In one collective farm, out of 600 centners distributed for working days, 70 were returned. Kaganovich. This is reminiscent of the Kulak's policy of red wagons. Put on pudik on it and drive it with a red flag. Pudik 16 kilograms. Kaganovich, 3. Search for stolen bread, and we should search for it in such a way that the pits themselves open, because otherwise we will not have enough strength to dig up the whole land. On December 21st, the diary entry ends with the meeting ended with the signing of commitments by the secretary of the district committees to complete grain procurement by certain dates and to export at least a certain amount of bread starting on December 26th. The meeting ended at 4 o'clock on December 25th. At 4:30, we left for Kherson. It is not surprising that Kobzar pleaded not guilty at the trial. After the meeting with Kaganovich on December 25th, 1932, he went to Garbuzinka accompanied by the new authorized representative of the Ukrainian Central Committee, Trichisky, who started teaching me his method, saying that we are playing and fiddling with people, that we need to implement a much tougher policy, expel thieves, demolish houses, etc. As a result of the action of the commissioners, all the food was confiscated from the peasants and houses were destroyed. Those who did not die of starvation did of the winter cold. Trichisky was shot on April 25th, 1934, in Kharkiv. He was rehabilitated by the Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine in January 29, 1992. It is clear that the case fits in the political campaign launched by Stalin in December 1932 against Ukrainian nationalism. During 1933, several thousand Ukrainian nationalists were convicted by various extrajudicial bodies. I would like to conclude with a striking episode some 20 years after the catastrophe of the Holodomor. On April 14 to 15, 1951, Ukrainian leaders Leonid Melnikov and Demyan Korotchenko held a 4-hour conversation with Stalin. They reported on the expansion of wheat crops and an increase in wheat yields in the Republic. Stalin commanded them, and according to Melnikov, stressed that the history of mankind knows many tragic examples when, due to lack of bread, entire nations died out and once and for all buried themselves in history. Note that Stalin did not speak of classes or social groups. He was talking about nations. Thank you for your attention.
So first of all, I want to thank Amir Weiner, director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and Jovana Knezovich, the associate director, for organizing this. And we owe you a great debt. Thank you very much. It's been a really nice. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists who have done, my colleagues who have done just a terrific job in presenting the various dynamics of the Holodomor to you and to fellow scholars. I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about the Holodomor, but also about the present, and about how the Holodomor and the present and the history of genocide, something I work on, kind of fits together. And let's see if it works. As you are aware by now, of course, the worst phase of the Holodomor took place a little more than 90 years ago, early 1933, when, as Robert Conquest wrote, Ukraine looked like, in his inimitable words, one vast Belsen, with Ukrainians dying or dead, scattered, over the landscape. There's been great gains in understanding the causes and the consequences and the course of the Holodomor, especially since the Orange Revolution in 2004 and since the Maidan in 2014. We've now linked up, the killing of the peasants and the death of this vast number of people. Conquest estimates about a fourth of the Ukrainian peasantry, with the attack on the intelligentsia, which Victoria told us about today, with the attack on the Ukrainian church, with the killing of Ukrainian priests, and with the crushing of the Ukrainian culture and language. This caused, in my view, and this links up with what Olga was saying earlier on, a kind of intergenerational trauma. And we actually know a lot about intergenerational trauma from Holocaust studies, but also from the study of the Armenian genocide, which took place as long as ago as 1950. In other words, it's not just the people who experience these traumas who suffer, but those their children and even their children's children who go through this kind of a trauma. It's important, therefore, to have sessions like this, to have museums, to have publications, to have scholars talk about what went on, to have films, and for academics to get together and fuss with one another about one part of what happened or another. Ukraine, I would suggest, was well on its way, to coming to terms as such with the Holodomor when the war broke out, in 2022. An initial trauma, in other words, was compounded by yet another trauma, and that is the trauma of Bucha, Izium, Mariupol, and other terrible things that happened in Russian-occupied Ukraine. Now, I want to link up this trauma then to atrocity crimes which have occurred in Ukraine during this war. And very quickly, some of you already know this, but I just want to go over this again. Atrocity crimes are something that have been defined by the International Criminal Court as fourfold. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, came out of really the history of genocide and of the history of the attempt of international society to deal with genocide. First of all, you can go back quickly over that history. I won't do it all, but Nuremberg in 1946, right, the Genocide Convention at the end of 1948, on to the development of Holocaust consciousness, we would call it, in the 60s and 70s, on to Bosnia, Rwanda, and Kosovo in the 1990s. And then finally, the foundation of the Treaty of Rome, which was the foundation of the ICC in 1998, and then 2002, the coming into being of the ICC. Okay, so let's go quickly over these crimes atrocity crimes. First of all, the crime of aggression. This comes out clearly of Nuremberg, where the Nazi criminals at Nuremberg were tried for the supreme international crime, and that's a quote, of aggression, meaning they attacked Poland, they attacked the Soviet Union, they attacked Yugoslavia, essentially defenseless countries, creating provocations and then attacking them with unwarranted violence. You should be aware that there was nothing about genocide at Nuremberg, almost nothing, that this did not have, the reason we hanged the Nazis at Nuremberg had nothing to do with genocide. It had to do with the crime of aggression. Now, the ICC has said and ruled that it cannot try Russia for the crime of aggression in Ukraine, where it's clearly guilty of it. We don't have to go over that for a variety of different reasons, but the main one has to do with the fact that Russia is not a party to the Treaty of Rome, and also has not allowed itself to be a party. The U.S. is not a party either. Ukraine's not a party, but have said that it abides by the Treaty of Rome and by the ICC. There have been petitions. I signed one to the General Assembly to set up a special court to try Russia for the crime of aggression. And recently there have been a lot of moves in that direction. I'm not going to go over them, but Ukraine itself has pushed the Western countries, and Poland now is leading, and the U.S. is being part of it, to set up a special body in The Hague to try Russia for the crime of aggression. And I suspect that's going to happen. That may happen in some of the other ICC trials. We can talk about that in discussion if you want. The second category is war crimes. And here it's quite clear that the Russians are committing war crimes, right? They're shooting innocent people on the street. They're blowing up domiciles, which is defined as a war crime according to Geneva and according to the ICC. They're doing all kinds of things that are easily identified as war crimes. The prosecutor general in Kiev says that they have identified 80,000 cases of war crimes. 80,000 cases of war crimes. Now, they don't have all the perpetrators. I have some of the numbers. He just testified to the Senate, to the House Foreign Relations Committee. He said we've identified 310. Now, remember, 80,000 cases. 310 perpetrators. We've completed 152 cases, and we've convicted 31 cases of war crimes, most of them in absentia. Right? In other words, they've identified the soldier who lives wherever, in Tomsk, who has done some of this shooting, and they're ready to go, in other words, with these cases. Crimes against humanity. They overlap with war crimes, right? Sometimes they're similar, and it depends on the context. Whether it's considered a war crime or a crime against humanity. The crime against, rape, for example, is a crime against humanity. It's also a war crime. And it depends on what the soldiers are doing at the moment, right? If they just take somebody out and rape them in a peaceful, occupied situation, that is a crime against humanity. If they do it when people are fighting, it's a war crime. But it's the same crime, right? It's the same crime. Kamala Harris said at the Munich Security Conference in April, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase this. She's a wonderful prosecutor. I don't know about vice president, but she's a great prosecutor. She said, we have the evidence. We've looked at the evidence. We know what the evidence says. The perpetrators will pay. In other words, that the office of the Vice President of the United States then has been collecting evidence, as has the State Department, as has the Justice Department, as have the Europeans, as have, of course, the Ukrainians, as have NGOs. So there are a number of NGOs that themselves are collecting evidence. There's an NGO of a group of journalists that Ann Applebaum wrote about that are going around Ukraine and collecting evidence and accumulating it for the courts. There are many others. that are doing this as well. And finally, genocide. This accusation of genocide has permeated the conflict. You probably know that the Russians accuse the Ukrainians of genocide, and that really upset the Ukrainians, who then took the Russians to court, to the International Court of Justice, not the ICC, to get them to, recant this accusation of genocide. And at the same time, they've taken to the ICJ the accusation of genocide against the Russians. Both President Biden and President Zelensky have said what's going on in Ukraine, this was especially after Mariupol, is genocide. And, it's very hard at this point. It's easier with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and war against aggression. I would suggest, my humble opinion, people are welcome to disagree, that it's very hard at this point to deal with the issue of genocide. In contrast to Holodomor, when we can talk about intent, and we have documents that prove intent, now to have those same documents that prove intent in the case of the Russians. We know they've said terrible things about Ukraine and Ukrainians, but can you really prove intent at this point? I would suggest it's very difficult. But it's clear that what's going on in Ukraine is genocidal. And by that I mean it surely looks like genocide. It surely smells like genocide, and it wags its tail like genocide. And I think that, again, to bring this up is an important part of the prevention of genocide. Remember, the Convention says the prevention and punishment of genocide. And to prevent genocide, you have to keep it in the eyes, I think, of the perpetrators and the people who may stand trial at one point. I mean, for the Ukrainians, clearly what is at stake is an attempt on the part of the Russians, to inflict yet another kind of double trauma on them. And I would suggest this double trauma happened during the Holodomor as well as today. That double trauma includes, first of all, the threat of elimination, right, as a nation and as a people, and get killed. In other words, you can get killed by the Russians. You can get taken away to the Gulag. You can be put in filtration camps and be tortured, and that sort of thing. And the second part is the threat to the nation itself as a collectivity, as an identity, as a group. And by the way, the essence of genocide, in contrast to war crimes and crimes against humanity, is an attack on a group as such. Its identity, how it looks at itself, how it feels about itself. So Ukrainians, in other words, are facing this double attack. No wonder they fight so hard. I mean, it's not just getting killed, right, or sent away. It's losing who they are and who they want to be. Now, I'm going to make three quick observations about genocide and the link to Holodomor and the present. One has to do with something that's already been brought up, and that is terror and torture. There is no genocide without terror and torture. And if you look at the Holodomor and you look at what's going on today, there are clearly parallels. And this is something that Amir has been working on as well, having to do with the history of the KGB. But, we've had this person come here named Andrei Soldatov, and Soldatov has this idea that the KGB today, the FSB today, is the heir of the NKVD of the 30s. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The people who were doing the torturing and the killing and the beating and the killing, of Ukrainians in 1932-33 are not so different from the people who are doing the same thing today. And the methods are the same. I mean, if you close your eyes and you read a couple of books, you can read Lynn Viola's book about Stalinist perpetrators, and you can read this book by Stanislav Aseev about torture camp, about torture in Ukraine. And you read those two books and you kind of close your eyes in some ways, you're in the same place. People are doing the same thing, and the people who are doing it are Russian perpetrators, and the people who are the victims are Ukrainian victims whose have usually no reason to even be there. A second part of this business of terror and torture, has to do with the role of sexual violence and rape. And this is something, by the way, that increasingly comes up in genocide studies. I mean, we're talking about it more, we know more about it. We know very little about what happened in 1932-33. I mean, there's this interesting article by Oksana Kish, who's been writing about this subject, talking about how Ukrainian mothers trying to save their kids and finding a bit of food, and you know why they're trying to find a bit of food, kind of sell themselves to collective farm chiefs and local policemen in order to feed their kids. I mean, that is a form, of sexual violence that clearly we do know about. Rape we know less about. People didn't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. There are a lot of issues when it comes to it. Maybe I'm interested that people are talking about cannibalism. It means that soon they will talk about rape if they if we can get to them. As you know, there's widespread sexual violence going on now in Ukraine. It's widespread in occupied Ukraine, Russian-occupied Ukraine. I mean, Russian soldiers are engaged in a program of rape. And rape, sort of like torture, has two components to it. One component is strategic, meaning you're trying to scare the hell out of the Ukrainians. You're trying to keep them from resisting. You're trying to get them to flee. And you're trying to diminish their sense of self. Right? So that's one powerful strategic component, that from above can be looked at as something positive. Again, we don't know about who's ordering what or who's determining what, but the extent of the rape has really been quite striking. I have a former student of mine in Canada who's writing about sexual violence, and it's really quite widespread, much more so than I had thought. The other part of it, I would suggest to you, is strictly gratuitous, meaning unnecessary, and brutal, violent action for no other reason than brutal, violent action. I mean, some people have suggested this is because the Russian soldiers don't know why they're there. They don't know what they're doing. They feel like they're killing their cousins for no good reason. And therefore, there's a kind of welling up of this violence in them. It's hard to know. And the final thing I would say in this connection of linking up genocides and linking up the Holodomor and what's going on today is denial. I mean, one of the things we've learned in genocide studies is that denial is part of genocide. It's there at the very core of genocide. It's sort of interesting phenomenon. You take something like the Armenian genocide in 1915 again. Immediately the Turks denied it, and they deny it to this very day. I mean, how many years, decades? Well, soon it'll be centuries later. Well, it is centuries later, isn't it? It is centuries later, a century plus later. They're still denying that there was a genocide in 1915. Same thing with the Holocaust. There was complete denial, and then they tried to cover it up at the end. And some Germans, not very many these days, will deny the Holocaust, and there are, as you know, Holocaust deniers around. But on the whole, that's over with, thank goodness. But the point is that at the core of what's going on in Ukraine is Putin and the Russians' denial of what they're doing. And so you get this kind of really bizarre, and my wife knows this because I watch late-night Russian TV before I go to bed at night, and she screams at me, and she can't stand it. She runs out of the bedroom when she hears me listening to it. I watch these talk shows at night, and it's just mind-boggling how they will completely reverse, the accusations. So, Ukrainians are accused of genocide, they're accused of rape, they're accused of war crimes, they're accused of crimes against humanity. They're setting up special bodies, to take Ukrainians to court for what they're doing in Donbass. All this kind of stuff, So there's a deep denial. And of course the Holodomor, right? At the very core of the Holodomor is Stalin saying there's not even any famine. There's not even any famine, right? But you take that forward in time to the Putin period, and what do you get? You get Putin saying, well, there was an all-Russian famine, but there was nothing special in Ukraine, that's all garbage. And then you get Russian historians who are marched out, and Vasylyev knows a lot about this, I'm sure, who are marched out, and they write big fat books saying, yes, there was an all-Russian famine, but nothing special about Ukraine. And we know that's not true. And we know that's a kind of, use of politics and propaganda, to shape the past. So just to conclude, I'm going to go back to where I started, and that is with the importance of coming to terms, with Holodomor. And my friend Marta Baziuk is here from the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium in Toronto, Canada. It spends a lot of time trying to get out there the message of what the Holodomor was about, and other people here in the room are supporters of trying to get that message out. It's still not out there the way we would like it to be out there, but it's important to come to terms with this. Also, to counter the Russian propaganda, which is very widespread, very deep, and very hard to uproot in some parts of the world especially. Even we have to think about ourselves. I think about, I don't think about him often, but I did when I was writing this talk, Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent, who said there's no famine, there's nothing wrong in Ukraine, and then he won a Pulitzer Prize, which I think we tried to take away from him, but we still haven't done. Is that correct? I think we still haven't got his Pulitzer Prize taken away. But there are other people, too, at the same time, who said, no, nothing's going on. And there are people today, in the United States who say, no, there was nothing special, right, about the famine. But it's interesting how history works, right? You learn from the past. It helps teach you about the present. So learning about Holodomor and the genocide that took place and the ability and the intention of the Russians, in this case Stalin and the Soviet government, to deprive Ukraine of its independence and the Ukrainians of their nationality, and killing so many millions in the process, teaches us about today, that it can happen too. It can happen again. So we don't want that to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We have time for questions.
Thank you so much for your talks. I just had a question for Dr. Mattingly. So you talked a little bit about how residents of villages were often the perpetrators also. You said up to 30% of people in a given village could have been perpetrating the requisitions, the, guarding storages, whatever. Was there any kind of reckoning after World War ended with these people, or did villages just sort of forget it happened almost? Because certainly if your family had been killed by someone, or your family had starved to death by someone, you would remember that, right?
Thank you for that question. It's a very interesting and important question, actually, because what I've seen on the ground, that these perpetrators were instrumental during the 1937 campaign of terror. So there was a pervasive culture of fear. So even though you saw your tormentor, there was nothing you could have done. About reckoning, under Nazi occupation, we see some of the reckoning taking place, especially with the so-called kurkul, again using the language of the perpetrators, returning to the villages and trying to take their houses back and take some revenge, actually. But I would say, and it's quite a poignant fact, that victims were stopped or prevented from any reckoning by the fear. In the 1980s, some perpetrators still maintained that line that they did everything, nothing wrong. Some denied their participation, others justified that they couldn't do anything else. And a minority did, obviously, showed remorse. But the victims, this is what we see when the crime goes without punishment, and victims are paying the price for many, many years after the famine. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Sanborn, Danil Zubieski. All my grandparents lived through the Holodomor, and my great-grandfather was one of the teachers that was killed in the 30s as well. My question, Daria, you mentioned you said we know how many people killed. I don't think we had mentioned any numbers today, and I've seen a wide range, so I thought I'd ask the panel. I've seen as much as 13 million, and if you can comment on what you think the accurate number is. And also, my two-part question is that given that this number could be as much as twice as much as the Holocaust, why do you think we're not teaching this in schools today?
That's a difficult question, actually. So,
you want me to start?
Sorry?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
You want to do it?
Let me start on the numbers issue. The numbers issue, most historians and most scholars agree on the number of 4 million, roughly, plus or minus. Now, that's a number that's been used for a number of years by Ukrainian scholars first and now by Western scholars. There are scholars in Ukraine and elsewhere who think the numbers are much higher. And I've seen now 11.5, scaled down to 10, scaled down to 9.5. So I think the numbers issue is still up in the air. But there have been a number of demographers and historians, again, who've gone over this issue, and people at Vasylyev's Institute have worked on this, and you might want to comment on this, where the 4 million number roughly is accepted. And the second part of your question exactly?
Just going off your last talk, and thank you for that, why don't you think we're teaching this, and why do you think it's just so...
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I'm teaching it. I got a student in the back of the class who's heard all about the Holodomor and has had it upside his head, and he even came to the conference today. So people are teaching it increasingly. We have a Holodomor center at Fresno, right? And Victoria is certainly teaching about it. And again, we have this Holodomor Research Consortium in Toronto. And Canada, throughout Canada, there are courses on Holodomor and on Ukrainian history and that sort of thing. And I think increasingly in this country, people are becoming increasingly aware of it. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And it's just one of those things. It was denied for so long. I think one of the things to say is it was denied I won't say it was denied here. Frank Sisson, one of our colleagues, has shown to me that people even in the 30s were talking about it a lot in the newspapers in Chicago and places like that. But in Ukraine, you couldn't talk about it, right, for a very long time. And the result is, what you needed in terms of scholarly material, you couldn't get. And, nobody would let you in the archives to go work on this. So it's only really in the 21st century, in some ways, that this has become a topic. And think comparatively about all genocides. It takes a long time to sink in, even the Holocaust. Right? It took a long time, from 45 until really the 70s in some ways, before it kind of sank in. And then you got a museum in the 90s, right? So that's already, fully 40 years after it took place. And now, and people could work on it. So now you've got the 21st century, people are working on it. Museum is opened, or did open in Kiev, and now, is in abeyance for a while. But there'll be a big museum in Kiev which will document it, and eventually, more and more monuments and that sort of thing here. I didn't mean to take the microphone from you, but go ahead if you want to add something.
The only details I can add that I agree with Norman said, especially about the numbers. So we have a number of articles in peer-reviewed periodicals. It's Ladun, Levchuk, Volovina, Mesler, different teams of demographers, historians looking at these numbers, and they did come to 4 million, and it's peer-reviewed and accepted number. With regards to the distance between the actual genocide and reflection in the study, we can see that social history of the Holodomor is coming along now, after 30 years of research, roughly almost 40 now. And it's the same trajectory as with the Holocaust studies. Anna Haikova's article on sexual violence only appeared relatively recently compared to other studies.
Do you want to add anything?
It's a difficult question, really. If it's possible, I don't want to ask on this question, because I have my colleagues, one part stay in one positions, another part stay in another position. And I have a delicious situation, but I think that a smaller date, lower date, is really than bigger, than higher, small, because we have research of many times research of our colleagues from Institute of Demography of Ukraine.
Thank you for your presentation today. I have a brief comment to outline the notion of historical memory, and I have a question primarily for the Ukrainian members of the current panel and also the previous panel if they're still here. So Japan occupied Korea for several decades, and many Koreans do not view this as just a historical event. They use it to engender hatred against today's Japanese, and they label this historical memory. So my question is, do today's Ukrainians have a historical memory toward the Russians? That is, do they view the famine as just a historical event to learn from, to study? Or do they also use it to engender hatred against today's Russians? And for the answer to this question, could you separate it into two parts? The first part would be, what is the answer if the Ukrainian war had not occurred and Russia did not invade? And then the other answer would be that I'm seeking is, what would the answer be if, given that the Ukrainian war did in fact occur and the Russians invaded?
Do you want to do this? No, okay. All right. By default. No, the answer to your question is of course. Meaning, of course, it's politics. Of course, it's international affairs. Of course, it's, Ukrainians' position vis-a-vis the United States and world opinion. In other words, and their own population. Meaning the Holodomor is an historical event for Ukrainians, but it also is illustrative for them, and I tried to indicate that in my talk, of what the Russians could do. In other words, we're learning all kinds of things. Again, history works in double ways, right? I mean, the present's always part of the past, and the past is always part of the present. I mean, you can't separate them. It's not, history's not some abstract chronicle of the past, right? It just sort of sits there on the wall, and historians just reproduce it. What it is what you see and what you're looking for and what you're sort of interpreting. So, for Ukrainians, the Holodomor is extremely important. It was important before the war. There was growing, and when I say before the war, I mean before 2014. If you think of the beginning of the war as 2014, when the Russians, occupied Crimea and Donbass, it was growing sense of historical understanding of the Holodomor and what it meant. There was growing anger, justifiable anger about what had happened, and a growing readiness to think about it, discuss it, and document it. I mean, this was a lot of the thorough document collections, a lot of the really great histories that came out of Ukraine, came out before the war of Holodomor. So already it's part and parcel of a sense of national consciousness which has grown since 1991, when Ukraine basically declared its independence. Right? So it's part of that. Now, what did the war do? Is the second part of your question, if I understand correctly. I mean, the war just accelerated all of it. I mean, it accelerated everything, and it sharpened everything. There's not a lot of time for the Holodomor right now, because of the actual war and actual people dying on the front and the actual crimes that are being committed. And by the way, Ukraine, one of the things I should have said in my talk is Ukraine's really committed to making these crimes, part of your life and mine. And they are. It's working, right? It's become part of American policy and European policy. Why are the Germans so involved? Well, part of it is they are, aware of war crimes and aware of genocide and aware of all this stuff, and they say to themselves, we got to help the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are feeding that. There's no question about it, both through the contemporary situation, but also through the historical one. So, it's a great question, actually, and I think, there are a lot of parallels then. Same thing with the Koreans. The Japanese really did awful things to the Koreans, and the history really does need to be told, and it really is part of Korean national identity and Japanese national identity, given what they had done. But the war itself has done all these things, accelerated everything. Putin didn't expect any of this, I don't think. And it's totally backfired on him. Exactly what he didn't want to happen has happened. A kind of unified, national-oriented, anti-Russian, Ukrainian national consciousness. And the anti-Russian part of it, is getting stronger and stronger, and Holodomor is part of that story, for good reason. You want to add something? Go ahead.
Well, one editorial comment.
Okay.
In Korean history, the story of Battleship Island is just so poignant and so piercing. And I must say, within Los Angeles, from where I come, the Korean community has been extremely supportive of Ukraine in our current situation, and I'm very grateful to them. I'd like to ask a question. I have heard on some of the Ukrainian channels that I listen to that there are historians that debate whether the Nazi absorption of what had happened in Holodomor during their occupation of Ukraine influenced or informed the final solution. Is there anything to that at all?
Do you know about this?
No, the Nazi did not need the
That would be my conclusion too. But
no, they came to kill the Jews, and they did not need.
They didn't
started
need,
doing it.
That would be my inclination too. Yeah. Do you want to, Marta?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Professor Naimark for mentioning that I'm representing the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. But I thought it would be interesting to this group to the question about why it's not taught, that there is a course in production that will be offered on the Coursera platform on the Holodomor that anyone in the world can take. So I wanted you to all know that it's being beta tested at the University of Alberta in the fall. It won't be publicly available until 2024, but in the 90th anniversary commemoration year of the Holodomor, I'm glad to say that this course is being produced and will be available to everybody. And my question is just, why is it important whether it was genocide or not to historians, or is it? You know, that's a
Well, since I study genocide, it's important to me. No, it's important because genocide is I should say, let's be scholarly about this. Genocide is a contested term. There's a book that's just out, a great big one, I don't recommend it, by Dirk Moses, who's a very fine historian of genocide, called The Problems of Genocide, in which he wants to get rid of the term, introduce a new term, very critical of the term, and thinks it's misused and abused. There's no question that the term is misused and abused. There's no doubt about that. Everybody wants to have their genocide, right? But I think that there's both a public and a scholarly understanding of what genocide is. And it roughly comes from, again, this, the UN Convention, the December 48 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. I've got it here, if I can read it to you if you want. But, it has a series of characteristics of genocide. I don't think it's a perfect, document. None is, even the American Constitution, right? It's not a perfect document, but it really is something that the courts have built from. That's what I tried to indicate before. The courts, the Rwanda court, the Bosnia court, built on that a document to produce an understanding in the world of international justice about what genocide is. Now, scholars, like to be scholars, and they like to say, oh, well, that's no good, and we should have another term, and how about my term, right? Or your term, or somebody else's term. I think that's a mistake, because when we have a group like this, mixed scholars, public, students, and others, we all sort of have a common understanding of what genocide is. We do. We may not, we may differ on the margins. In that case, then, to understand that the Holodomor, and even what's going on today, again, take Biden and Zelensky, and what they said, to understand that this belongs to the history of genocide, is important. It's important politically, it's important conceptually, it's important, in terms of how to mobilize people to try to stop it, to try to keep it from happening. So I tend to disagree with those who get very fussy about the term and say we ought to abandon it and that kind of thing. I think that doesn't make any sense.
And if I may add and build on this, the definition of genocide as stated in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, what is important is not the numerical threshold. It is not a characteristic of genocide. But limiting the number or covering up the number of victims, that is one of the denial tactics. So I just want you to keep that in mind. And number two, the intent. That is the main characteristic of genocide. And we clearly see the intent being broadcast on the Russian state television. So, and second point is about the war. It is not the war for territory. This is the war for history. What history and who will determine whether it will be the Soviet communist style of history or whether Ukraine will be able to decommunize and decolonize its history, or the Ukrainian scholars and historians will be able to write their own history, purified of the Soviet narrative.
Thank you. I want to actually take us back to more nitty-gritty details, if I may. I wanted to ask if you know, I was so interested in learning how many local Ukrainians were actually involved in the process. And I'm wondering if you have enough information that you could describe how it could operate, because I assume those are the people who survived. How, if they're in the villages, how are they able to get food, keep food when they're starving people around them, and keep from being killed or robbed so that the people around them could eat? So I'm just wondering if you could paint some kind of picture of how that, how that worked.
Okay, thank you for the question. First of all, to answer that question, I would use the survivor testimonies from Poltava province with which I worked, over 200 of them, so it's a quantitative study. They indicate, all survivors or victims, they indicate that majority, up to 95%, of perpetrators who came to search their houses were local people organized by plenipotentiaries. So plenipotentiaries, people sent from towns, cities, they didn't have to be there necessarily. They came with orders, but it was done with local hands. When we're talking about numbers, for example, I mentioned teachers, 40,000. But then, for example, such a youth militarized organization, So Aviahim, they had 22,000 young people guarding the fields in 1933. Then we have communist members of the Communist Party, 112,000, but not all of them participated. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people being involved in the mechanism. Even if they were Ukrainians themselves, it doesn't deny the fact that it was genocide. With regards to food, how people survived. So we know that the policy changed in summer 1933, but until then there were different survival strategies. So there was sexual barter that has already been mentioned. I would add actually to sexual violence during the Holodomor. It was not instrumentalized by the state, so it was more of a violence accompanying violence. So it was just going hand in hand rather than instrumentalized like it is currently in Ukraine by the Russian soldiers to demonstrate their power. But there were three major forms of sexual violence. Barter, and that helped some people to survive, or survival prostitution sometimes it is called, mutilation, and rapes. And against rapes, actually, unlikely protector of Ukrainian women at the time was Zatonsky, who's been mentioned, I think, by Victoria or Bogdan today, who said that Soviet authorities should show trials of those sexual predators who were in some districts very infamous, to show that at least there is some justice and suppress uprisings. But otherwise, there were different techniques, and of course connections, personal connections did matter. If you were relatives or friends with local officials, it did help. But summer 1933, it's when this requisition stopped, and private vegetable plots did help later on as well. Valeriy, you might add on.
If you let me, I turn to a question of genocide. Two words, sorry. Because I think we have three good ideas for continuing research. First of them, the idea of SSSR as empire, a specific empire, and we can research relations in society and relations between society and dictator with idea of imperial and colonial relations, because it's no reset in Ukrainian history in the years of 1932, 1933. Second idea is genocide as continuing process, because we have a break between juridical conception of genocide, organization of a nation, and real historical researchers. And third idea, I think we must, and today we must, and we can make of new definitions based on sphere of genocide, Holodomor as genocide, because we need a new categorical apparatus, categorical definition when we can continue to reset, because you know that break without juridical, yes, sorry for my English, juridical conception, juridical definition, and we are historians, and we need new definition. And new definition make without our whole work, our mutual work. If we have a new base, new categorical base, new definition base, we can continue our work for thinking, rethinking, for thinking Holodomor, rethinking Holodomor. Yes, thank you.
Just a more of a comment, if I may. I'm not sure why my colleagues experience some difficulty in answering this question about the numbers, because probably it would be prudent to suggest that we will never, ever know the exact number of those people who perished during the Holodomor. Point number one. I have a sort of a bit of a problem, and I don't mean to challenge Norman, my favorite scholar ever,
it's
terrific, with whom I agree on the majority of points that you make. But when we suggest that the majority of scholars agree on the 3.4 or 3.9 million, I would say we have to conduct some research to understand if this is the majority of scholars who actually agree on this number. It's time to suggest that at least in this audience, I know two people, including myself, who disagree with this number. And I have a very good sort of set of documents that would suggest that it's just a very low number. I'm not jumping to any conclusions suggesting that 10th, 12th, 13th. But for me, it's very difficult to reconcile two numbers. 1.2 million people who perished only in the Kharkiv Oblast and Kharkiv itself, and 3.4 or 3.6 or even 3.9 of total numbers in Ukraine. So these two numbers are sort of very problematic to me. I mean, in terms of reconciliation. So, I mean, the answer probably to your question would be in the future, we probably establish some the lowest number and the highest number, and that's what we probably would look at in the future, because to accept one number or another, I think it's a little bit short-sighted. I mean, we shouldn't accept any numbers. We shouldn't put a period and suggest that this is the end of our research. 3.6 because the demographers said so. I mean, we are developing in terms of our research. We're conducting research. We continue our research. There will be more documents, more evidence, and we have to keep our minds open.
Let me just say I agree with that, but I mean, Daria already cited, a half a dozen or so of the leading articles on this subject, which use roughly the 4 million number. And, you have to use a number. I mean, this young man said, nobody said anything about a number. Well, you need to. I mean, you need to at least give it a go. And I agree with you. I mean, I doubt, as Amir knows, we've talked about this, I doubt NKVD numbers on everything. I just think we use the NKVD numbers a lot. 779,322 people were shot. Well, come on. You know, I mean, the 322 part, you know, they couldn't possibly have that kind of accuracy. Are they roughly accurate or not? I don't know. So, I mean, your basic point, I think, is a well-taken one, and that we don't know, and I tried to express it that way, that there are people who think there are others. Write it up, Olga. Write your article, send it to the journal. We'll read it, we promise, and, convince us.
I would like just simply to say one thing about, just to put it all together. As an historian of the Soviet Union, especially with an emphasis on Ukraine, the study of the Holodomor, for me at least, cannot be completed without the connection to the Second World War. And this is something very important. The Holodomor, in many instances, became another victim of the Second World War. No justice was offered there. So many more people died during the Second World War. The calamity of the Second World War overshadowed everything. And there is something interesting also in the symbolic politics of the Holodomor versus the Second World War. Every nation is looking for a foundational myth. Until very recently, there was a big battle in Ukraine between the Second World War, the May 9th, of course, and the Holodomor. What would be the foundational myth of the nation? I think that one of the casualties of the criminal attack on Ukraine is that it is decided. That what happened in Ukraine last week is something fascinating. The removal of May 9 of the calendar and moving back where it should have been already May 8th. It's sending the message that no longer the Second World War will be the core date of the calendar. And that is, of course, as Norman said, was not an intended result of the invasion of Ukraine. I think that what is happening just in front of our eyes, before our eyes, is that Holodomor would become the foundational myth of the independent Ukraine. And with this, I think we should conclude.